Okay, sorry about that.
You could even repeat that list again.
All right, so what I want to point out about this list, children, parents, older adults, people with disabilities, at least the first 4 of 6 are by default the populations that you serve, whether you're a school or you're a meeting. And you may have people in the final 2 categories as well. So we need to be especially sensitive to the emotional and spiritual repercussions of a disaster, just by virtue of the people that we work with. Children are going to get more attention in this presentation, and that's partly because they aren't adults. We are adults, so we're maybe more familiar with our own ways of processing. We've had to deal with our own processing for the length of our adult life. And children respond differently to traumatic experiences. When there hasn't been a new routine established, they can't go back to school. Their home life is not the same way that it was. There can be a lot of issues with safety, stress, extended grieving, and emotions can come up: hopelessness, depression, guilt, withdrawal. One of the documents that's been produced about school responses I liked says, severe cases you'll see classroom behavior and academic performance impacted. Probably that's just the base would be that academic performance is impacted, not to mention all the kind of interpersonal and interior experiences that need to be acknowledged and processed. As communities, when we think about what our populations are going through, whether they're children or older adults or anyone, there are two influences that we want to be aware of. The first are risk factors. These are influences that increase the probability of the onset, regression to, or maintenance of a problem condition. In a natural disaster, seeing a traumatic event over and over and over again is a risk factor. So 9/11 was more traumatic for people who were watching it on TV over and over and over again. That made it hit them in a different way than at another historic time when they were seeing something once. The proximity of the event to an individual. So has your school been evacuated or other schools evacuated? So how close is this event to me? And then coping with multiple losses at the same time. This is a tricky one because we won't know in our population. We might know. We hope we'll know. But we need to be mindful. Did one of our students just lose a dog? Actually, that, in the context of now a natural disaster, might make it harder to cope. Has an elderly member of our community recently lost a spouse? That's going to make it more difficult to be resilient than they would be if that hadn't just happened. So those are the risk factors we want to be mindful of when we're tackling our response to a natural disaster. But what about protective factors? These are the combination of forces that contribute to adaptive outcomes in the face of challenges or trauma. And I really want to focus on this. We'll have another slide on what this can create, but this is the role of a meeting or a school. It's to be one of the protective factors. It's to make a response that allows people to feel safe, to feel like they can be resilient. So how we respond can be a protective factor. Creating space for children and adults to start to reflect on what has happened. The opposite of what I shared as a risk factor, limiting media exposure, especially in the direct aftermath. Being calm, present adults, and I think this is to the point of everything that's come before, which is if you have a plan, it's easier to be a calm staff or a calm united meeting because you're putting a plan into place. And if there's nothing in place, it's much harder to be, present and open as people are looking to you to handle the situation. And finally, thinking as spiritual communities about prayerful activities that can give meaning to what happened. I'm going to show a video that Save the Children made about Katrina. And it's an interesting video because it's talking with people who were children during Katrina and 10 years later got interviewed about their experience. And you'll hear that there was not as much support for these people in terms of the mental health, the spiritual support side. And it made it harder to cope with what happened than it would have been just having that happen and then getting greater support. Let's see if I can figure it out.
Research actually tells us just by having a plan, even if your plan fails catastrophically, folks are more likely to recover faster.
Isn't that interesting?
It's just the psychology of the fact that, hey, at least I had a plan. I knew I had a plan. I could make a plan how to move forward versus just being totally frozen in fear. So.
I hope the sound's going to work okay.
Katrina is a constant reminder. I'm reminded of Katrina every time I wake up and I'm not where I'm supposed to be and my dad is not here. Honestly, after my dad died, I really felt like I just don't have nothing to live for. Like, that was all I had, and not since he gone, I don't need to be here.
Experiencing disaster and then coming into a school where everyone doesn't like you and you think it's funny to make fun of the fact that you lost everything had me really numb at the time.
I felt like I wasn't seen, but it was a nightmare and this was real and I was real. And I was still a child, but we didn't have that support at all.
Because of Katrina, I lost family, I lost hope, and I lost memories.
I lost my father, which was my everything.
I lost my innocence. I lost the opportunity to grow and mature. I was forced to grow up.
The hardest part was me not knowing where my parents were.
And the hardest part was dealing with the aftermath after Katrina.
What people don't understand is that kids are emotional and they hold a lot inside and they don't know ways to express themselves.
What people don't understand when you're a kid is that catastrophe is out of your control. It's up to the adults. It's up to the government. It's up to society to make everything right.
10 years later, I'm still confused as to, I guess, why people didn't care.
10 years later, I still believe that things can change for the better.
When a disaster happens, what a child needs
is a support system, someone who will back them up.
Somebody to be there.
It's a pretty heavy, powerful video. Any reactions?
You can see that they're still impacted 10 years later.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the young woman was smart enough to know. I went to a school where nobody liked me and nobody cared about me. They knew who was left behind. They knew who was bussed into that large stadium. I can't imagine getting over there.
For me, this video is really a reminder that whether or not we tackle the physical building, or sometimes those details, they take priority in our mind, they feel easier to plan for. But if we have tended to the emotional and spiritual well-being of the people in our care and the community at large, we've probably done the most important service that we could do. And so as you go back with all these checklists and so much to kind of work through, I hope that you'll carry with you that sense of opportunity and responsibility to also be holding the emotional and spiritual space.
And really it comes down to hope. And this could be any, whether it's the big one like Katrina or any personal disaster.
Yep,
they need
fostering
that
hope.
one caring adult and that promise of hope, because what you may be able to give them may be completely not what they need at the end of the day, but the fact that somebody cares is amazing. What a difference that makes.
Thank you. Pat?
We go through our lives and we have this trust that our community will stand with us.
Yeah.
And take care of us, and that if things go bad, we'll get together and help each other.
Yes.
That didn't happen today.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Well, the refugee children from our Mexican border are right up there.
Also very dark. Yes.
What are we doing to them?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, for me, I mean, no matter how long it is after the fact, whenever I see this, I think that these are people of color. I don't know if that would have happened if it had been mostly Caucasians, if they would have the same treatment, and it still wounds me and makes me angry.
Yeah.
The way all that was handled.
On the list of at-risk populations,
yeah.
Historically marginalized, traumatized
yeah.
groups is one of them, and that's an invitation. If your meeting, for example, does not comprise of folks in that category, then that's all the more reason to be thinking about how do we reach out to our broader community to make sure that we're not just responding to the folks in our immediate reach. Thank you. All of this is the opportunity to not leave the children in our reach the way that those Katrina children were, and the language that we use in psychology and development, thinking about post-traumatic stress syndrome, is that we want to be fostering post-traumatic growth. So that means that something really difficult has happened, but we want to be fostering resilience and creating an environment where they can feel like they've actually been able to learn something about themselves, to build community, and to be better. So there was a quote saying that many people believe that even though they've survived a traumatic experience and have been negatively impacted, they also have grown or been strengthened by the experience. And that's really what our responsibility is. It's to be leaders, to model healthy processing, to offer resources so that people within our reach can feel like they have grown from this experience that they've been through, rather than that they were victims and that they were actually ignored or left behind. Specifically working with children, we want to think about ways that they might process that are different from adults. They can't always articulate in words the same way that we can in a talk therapy setting that we set up. So you might want to think about having some things in your community's back pockets to have activities ready to use, art and dramatic play. This was an example in a school in New Orleans saying, I survived the flood. So this is their opportunity to be heroes in a really challenging situation. Another model that has been used is creating peer listening teams. You don't need your school psychologist or the one social worker or therapist who happens to be a meeting member to do all of the work. Set up opportunities for people to listen to each other and dialogue about what's happened. And then the final part or recommendation is to be flexible. There was an example in Katrina where afterward, one of the girl didn't have her knee-length socks that she was supposed to have in school, and the teacher pulled her aside to reprimand her. You need to have your, and found out she had lost everything, so she didn't have her socks. So it's sometimes tempting as adults to want to, kids need routine, and we want to get back to routine, but not at the expense of honoring that may just not be available, and we may need to slow things down. We may need to make exceptions for what has been a norm or a rule. These are just things to keep in mind. Spiritual stress reactions to disaster. Some of these were mentioned in the video. Questioning meaning and justice. Feeling very far from previously held beliefs. Suddenly turning away from God, turning to God, feeling isolated from God or from their religious community, being angry at God or feeling let down by spiritual leaders, feeling disconnected from familiar religious practices. Guiding spiritual principles for providing spiritual care. You can't really read it, but it says, we want to meet, accept, and respect persons exactly as they are. When we have a physical plan, it's a little bit easier to discern. We just need to do these things. But in terms of mental and spiritual health recovery, someone may be in denial. They're not ready for counseling. Someone else may be totally grieving. They need a listening ear. We need to be flexible enough to meet people where they are. Do no harm. Don't want to add to what's happened. Nurture and encourage each person's own spiritual perspective to be a source of strength in difficult times. Protect confidentiality. Respect social diversity and cross-cultural settings. Function at the levels appropriate to your training and educational background. And this is something, if you have a lot of people that you're going to need to start working with children, sometimes people need background checks or other things. There may be exceptions in a disaster setting, but if you know you have teams you're going to call on in an emergency situation, it's not a bad idea to put those kind of things in place. And help to understand and normalize what happened. Oh, I'm so sorry, I don't know why it's doing this. Spiritual care and best practices supporting healing. Like I said, understanding and normalizing what happened. Carrying out spiritual care through the practice of presence. Quakers are really good at this, so it's an opportunity to lean on our Quakerly roots and offer presence. Identify and solve immediate concrete problems. Spiritual care is also just feeding everyone when people need food and then listening. Encourage individuals to talk about their experience and be an active and supportive listener. Again, it's easy to want to fix problems for people, but in a disaster, most people need to be listened to because everyone's story is going to feel really unique and personal to them. And attend to recognize normal stress reactions, make referrals to higher level counseling professionals or medical professionals when that's needed, and attend to anniversaries and other important dates. So I want to suggest that there are two ways that meetings and friend schools can immediately respond, and one is meeting for worship, a moment to gather in community, to process what's going on, to see healthy communication and support modeled. And let's see. So I want to start by asking, has there been a time in your meeting or at your school that there has been a called meeting in response to some kind of crisis? And what is the impact of that? Has this happened before?
We share space with a Jewish organization, and after the shootings in Pittsburgh, we gathered together and talked.
Powerful. And that was, so that was an interfaith setting, it sounds
Yes.
like. Great. Thank you.
At Westtown School, on the day of 9/11 and the day after, we immediately gathered in the meeting house. And we spent more than an hour together at the upper school.
Okay. You've gotten a handout, and I think about half of you got it upside down, so you may not see these questions right away. I want to invite you to just brainstorm for yourself, for your organization. If there was a disaster, when would a meeting for worship occur? Would you wait till the programmed meeting happened and invite people to reflect on what it's been like for them? Would you call a meeting for worship that day? Would you wait for members or family members to be united, process what's happened, and then come together? If anything comes to mind, feel free to jot it down so that you have it for your own record and taking back to your community.
I was just thinking, after the shooting in the club in Florida, we just opened up the meeting house and put a sign out that said meetings open for worship for anyone.
Right.
And that's how I would imagine us handling something like this.
Yeah.
Not a called meeting per se, but just a safe place for people to come.
So in that example, you still held meeting on a Sunday,
Sure.
and you opened it to a larger
No,
community.
we held it the next day.
Oh, you
We
did?
didn't wait till Sunday.
Okay, all right, great, thanks for clarifying.
Is there a personal connection, or was there a reason why that particular disaster resonated with your community?
I don't know. Somebody just called the clerk and said, I think we should have the meeting house open.
It seems like there are a lot of different possibilities in these questions.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not left just one answer. If I have, two people can make a meeting. So if we know that there's someone in trouble, right, we go and we find them and we meet with them and we worship. Again, leaving the meeting house open, I think, is important, and having someone there who can greet people, even if we take turns on that. Isn't that interesting? The assumption is that I'll never be in trouble. I'm going to be the person who's waiting there to help people. That's amazing. And this idea about children and uniting with families, I think kids and parents have to be helped when that happens. So there's a lot of different ways people are going to get together.
Yep. And you're bringing up, you have a plan, and then you have a backup plan, and you have the person who might decide to call a meeting, and then you have a backup person who might take responsibility for calling a meeting.
Right.
So on that sheet, I think you can see, thinking about who would be the go-to people in your meeting to run it. Where would you hold a meeting for worship if your school meeting house or if your meeting house was unusable? What queries or format would you use?
Don't forget the care for the caregiver aspect as well. Both yourselves as well as those in your community who are out helping others, who are eventually going to need these things to toll on them as well.
So these are things to think about for Quaker organizations. This is something that we're known for, that people will be looking for us to offer. The timing of it and how it's presented and held is important. The other way that I want to think about that we can offer immediate support and ongoing support is through counseling and deep listening. This can be in a group format or one-to-one, but meetings in schools can be places where people are invited in to process what's going on. So there are questions for you to reflect on. Who is on call to support students and families or meeting members in a crisis? Do you have someone right now that you could call on if there was need? Meetings should think about, is it someone in pastoral care? Who is that? Is it the school psychologist? What skills do they need to be effective in this kind of a crisis setting? What is your immediate mental health support plan, and what resources would you put in place long-term to help students and members cope? Remembering that the mental health piece is kind of the long game. It's what we have to keep returning to so that people aren't feeling forgotten once, the generator has been turned off because the electricity is back on, things look like they're back to normal, but for some of the folks in our community, they won't feel back to normal, and we don't want that to go forgotten or unnoticed. Any thoughts about this portion?
Well, it occurs to me that the answers to a lot of these questions are, it depends. What are we talking about? When is it? A whole lot of variables. But my thought is that both the meeting and the school need to think about how do they want to be in the community.
Yeah.
And if we think, well, we really could be a community resource, then we need to be able to say, okay, we would do that. When somebody feels a leading that this is a time when we're offering this to the community, then this is how we implement it. I mean, you could plan that,
yeah.
But you wouldn't necessarily plan what kind of disaster, but just to decide you're going to do it and put a little bit of planning in place, and then you're ready to go.
Yeah.
And the context of it, the way you're handling the worship, how you're advertising, all that's going to depend on what you're talking about.
That's such a great point, and I'm struck by the research that people have shared throughout, which is it's not going to be, we can't plan an exact fit for what happens, but if we have no plan, we surely won't respond as well. If we have a plan to think about mental and spiritual support, even if it's modified because it's, the teachers who are doing the listening because they're in the classroom, or as long as we've talked about a plan, something more fruitful is likely to come out of it. And that's the benefit of building the spiritual care into your plan, whatever your plan is. Yeah, yes.
I think one of the most important things on that list is the long term.
Yeah.
Because a few weeks ago I was watching a show and there were kids that were involved in one of the school shootings. And they were the victims. And it was 2 years hence, and they still didn't feel safe being in the schools.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So relevant. It's, getting a sense of normalcy, safety back. It's, it takes real effort in terms of the kind of support that we offer.
I also think that the plan can't be secret.
Right.
Ever. and I'm not sure how to do, right now, if I'm right, there are 4 people on our committee, and we're just beginning, and we have 350 people who are, members and attenders, so, no, there's a good chance that 4 of us won't be around when they need help. So it can't be, so what do? Have conversations, have meetings, it can't be a secret plan.
It's a great point. Is there like a document that you develop that's pretty simple and straightforward that gets mailed out to families and attenders or to families and students saying, this is our plan, so you know, and we hope that you'll engage and participate if there's need? Or is it at the end of meeting or during an assembly, you give an overview of the plan? That we do get faulted for things when we've got a great plan in place and it got put in a drawer and then nobody knew what it was. That definitely looks bad. It's good to make sure it's been shared and duplicated and yeah.
You know the one fault with Quakers though.
We might talk about it too much?
No, well we have 20 steps on the refrigerator on how to make coffee correctly. And it gets edited often.
The more gets added to it.
So these are things to think about while we're making our plan. All right, so I wanted to just to make this a little more interactive, I pulled out some examples of churches and schools that really did have disasters and how they responded. And so I wanted to look at the kind of general topic of the disaster, what was the real disaster, and how could you imagine your schools and meetings responding, just as a brainstorm. And then for most of them, we'll look at how did they respond. So in this case, the topic is that members of the larger community have been harmed or lost, not directly your meeting or your school. And the example is in 2011 in Allentown, that a gas explosion happened, 5 residents were killed, including an infant. So imagine now this is your area. How do you, as the meeting or as the school, respond? Maybe just talk to a neighbor. Turn and share with a neighbor how you might respond.
And I assume you're assuming that nobody in the meeting or the school community, their families were not involved.
That's right. In this example, share with a neighbor.
How we talk about
You need to find out. Whether the church or whatever, somebody else in that community that you can say, how can we support you?
That's just taking care of our policy. Children, but understanding that anytime something like this happens.
They got troubles and people respond well to that. Quite a lot.
You have to put yourself out.
Well, Facebook is a place where I think you need to begin
Yeah, what came up?
well before that explosion. We have a daughter who's a health professional, and she was at the house, and there were a whole bunch of kids in the living room.
We're going to come back.
Because
There were a whole bunch of kids. There were a lot of children in our family, and everybody was in the living room with our oldest daughter. And I mentioned something that had happened recently. Somebody died, something happened, and her first response was,
In front of the children.
yeah. Now, her 2 children are 15 and 12. We're not talking about a baby. And she's a woman with a doctorate. So, the conversation has to start a long time prior to a gas explosion.
Well, what is it that you would want to be coming out of that conversation? Is it preparedness? Is it Having skills to grieve,
Yes.
what's the goal?
Yeah, teaching skills to grieve,
Okay.
teaching the fact that, the 3-year-old, he asked me where my mother was. I said, my mother was very old and she died. Your mother died? I don't think he said, my mother will never die. She's very strong. And I said, I think you're right about that. Your mother is very strong.
I love that you're saying that because there are, and this would be a longer conversation, but there are definitely developmental markers of how, what different age children can and should be exposed to be able to maintain a sense of safety. When we are able to, protect certain ages from certain things, we do want to be mindful of that. So thank you. How about others?
I've had to deal with multiple emergencies, and I wanted to respond to that. What would happen, there'd be artillery fire, and my kids would come running, and not just my kids, but all the kids in the building would, gather where the adults were, find out what's happening. And it really worked for us to be calm, not to minimize it, but to be very serious and say, this is what we have to do. It happened once that there was one parent who was hysterical, and all the children were affected, at least briefly.
Yeah.
But they came back to their own parents. But if you minimize it, they get it, and they don't trust you the next time.
Yeah. So I think you're saying, being calm, being real, but also being actionable. If there are things, concrete things you can do, focusing on those things, that's within the scope of what helps a child regain safety.
The parent who was hysterical had no control over her children. They were just too terrified. They just couldn't, she just couldn't handle them.
Yeah.
Or she couldn't handle herself even.
Makes sense. Too bad. So in this case, the local Lutheran church responded in a couple of different ways. The next day, they held a worship to process what was going on, and they allowed media to be present to then share that there was worship and prayer happening in response to this, and to invite people to come to a larger vigil at a later date. They hosted a vigil, and they made counseling available. So this is the way one community organization responded. Let's look at another example. There's such extreme flooding and strong wind that students cannot go home for 6 hours. They're either stuck at your meeting or they're stuck at your school. How might you respond? Again, talk in pairs.
We sat around making up stories.
I think, I know.
Making up children's books, so we would make up the stories. We just brought it the kids would start back and so we get it back.
Yeah, there's situations like that, you know, when you were locked down like that, first time you
Really?
okay.
And we wrote down those things, your kids do pictures like
Being your soul seed about these communication pieces, so how to focus on the best for them. Las seis de la
I mean, we have a phone there, we have bathrooms, we have.
Take another 30 seconds. What came out of this conversation? What did you imagine doing? Communication. Right. So being transparent with students about what's going on and coordinating well with parents. What else?
But the counseling staff actually, because a lot of times if you can't calm the student down, they can't, you said they have a lot of scope to deal with.
Yes.
But for the most part, or in my school anyway, they listen. They don't.
So I think you're saying offer adults who can provide grounding and support to people
Somebody
who
that can
need it.
identify with it.
And that could be someone who's technically in a support role or someone who's just trusted and known in the community. Okay, what are other thoughts, other ways you would respond?
Have activities available to them
Yes.
to try to normalize what's going on.
Right. Don't make people sit in lockdown and just be with their peers. If you can generate something that's positive, helpful, engaging, community building, plan for that.
Well, the teachers are big role in that. Most of the teachers have projects or whatnot that they could be working on at that time.
Fantastic. Yeah. Calling on teachers and other leaders. Great. So the example that I highlighted was from this month in Southside Elementary School and McKinney High School in Cleveland, Texas. They had over 14 inches of rain in one day, and at 3 p.m. the campus went to lockdown because buses and cars couldn't arrive to pick kids up. So then what do you do with them? What structures are in place to make that not a traumatizing situation, or to make it allow people to be as resilient as they can be? So all of these things got said, before or now. It's really hard today because every child and adult has their own cell phone and immediate access to news. But if we can provide a safe environment where we're not getting that constant stimulation, that's good. Consider business as usual or promoting spiritual and connecting activities, just what was mentioned. And then be methodical, thank you, in transitions to maintain calmness and efficiency, right? It's not a flood out the door, there's just even pacing to get kids home or whatever is in place.
Knowing that first one can be hard too, because sometimes the adults are the ones that want to see what's going on. They want the very latest development. And we have to remember that to do that in a way that isn't exposing children to more trauma.
And that may be a part of the protocol. That may be a part of the plan, saying to teachers, thank you so much for sitting with your kids and being with them, or to the Sunday school folks or whoever. And if we can have a kind of, if we can decide as a group what we're sharing with the younger people rather than having you just throwing out the latest data, that would be great.
And if they know that there is somebody who's keeping on top of
and
things.
you will be updated every hour or something like that.
Or as
you need to be the authentic source of communication, because if you're not, everyone else will be.
Right.
They're going to be putting your image, your school, your response, they're going to be putting all that out there unless you have already thought through, this is the one person, they're putting out the information, they're doing it in a timely manner. So it's going to play one way or the other. Either you're going to be the heroes for doing this really well and communicating that this is what we're doing, or you're going to be on the other side of that.
Yeah. So we're going to shift to talking